On the 12th of November 1883, the deep frost finally took hold of the Montana earth. The frozen dirt roads became ruts as hard as iron, capable of shattering a wagon wheel. That same day, Sarah stood before a newly covered grave. The wind lashed at the hem of her black dress, snapping it against her boots like a whip. She clasped the hand of her 8-year-old daughter, Clara, whose tiny fingers had started to turn blue even through wool mittens. Only the two of them remained by the grave. The other mourners had already gone back to their warm carriages and houses, concluding the funeral for her husband. Yet the true tragedy had only started. It waited silently for them at the farmhouse, which Sarah had scrubbed and cared for over a decade. The wind brought the smell of impending snow, a heavy, metallic scent that every frontier woman recognized as a sign of danger. Sarah gave Clara's hand a squeeze, a wordless vow that she remained by her side, even though the man who had shielded them was no more. They made their way back to the homestead. The house loomed gray and immovable against the overcast sky. Smoke rose from the chimney, a sight that ought to have been inviting but felt instead like a luxury they were soon to forfeit. In the kitchen, the warmth failed to soften the expressions of the two people awaiting them. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, her deceased husband's parents, sat at the table like statuesque judges. They had always disapproved of Sarah. She came from a humble background, a woman without a dowry, whose calloused hands were not to their taste. When her husband was alive, he had stood as a barrier between Sarah and their contempt. Now that barrier had vanished. Mr. Miller did not even invite them to sit. He put a heavy hand on the table, his gaze directed past Sarah, as though she were already a specter. "The deed belongs to the Miller name," he stated, his tone emotionless and utterly without sorrow. "My son is dead. This land, this house, it goes back to the family, to the bloodline." Sarah felt the air vanish from the room. She drew Clara nearer, sheltering the child behind her skirts. "We have no place to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking yet clear above the stove's crackle. "Winter has arrived. You cannot turn a child out in November." Mrs. Miller rose, then smoothed her apron in a brisk, dismissive gesture. "We've arranged for a boarding house in town that will accept you for 1 week. After that, you'll be on your own. You have until sunset to gather your personal belongings. Leave the furniture and the provisions behind." It was a death warrant disguised as an eviction notice. They were expelled with only the clothing they wore and what they could hold in their arms. They were thrust into a world that was quickly turning frigid. The farmhouse door slammed shut behind them with a finality that reverberated in Sarah's very bones. They stood on the porch, the wind immediately cutting through their coats. They possessed a small handcart, a shaky contraption normally used for transporting firewood. Sarah had loaded into it everything she was permitted to bring: 2 thick wool blankets, a cast-iron frying pan, a sack of dried beans, a small pouch of flour, a hatchet, and a lantern with half a bottle of oil. It was a pitiful collection for staying alive. Amidst a Montana winter, Clara gazed up at her mother, her eyes large and glistening, tears already freezing on her lashes. "Mama, where are we going?" she asked, her voice tiny and fragile. Sarah glanced toward the town, where the boarding house stood, a place of filth and disease that would quickly consume their scant funds. Her eyes moved to the road, then to the thick line of trees at the boundary of the land. Locals called it the Devil's Acre, since the ground was too stony to cultivate and too wild to subdue. "We are not going to town, Clara," Sarah declared, feeling a strange, cold determination settle within her chest. "We will find our own home, a better one." They trudged 2 miles, pushing the cart over frozen roots and piles of withered leaves. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of violet and black like bruises. Sarah realized the temperature would fall to freezing tonight. Without shelter, they would not survive till dawn. She scanned the forest, searching for a rock overhang, a cave, anything. Then she spotted it. A massive natural wonder, an ancient western red cedar. That tree must have been a seedling when the Romans were building their empire. It was now dead, struck by lightning decades ago. Its top shattered, but the stump remained a huge, brooding base nearly 15 feet across. The lightning had hollowed out the center, burning away the heartwood and leaving a rough, cavernous shell. It looked like a dark, gaping mouth, terrifying and untamed, but to Sarah, it seemed like their only chance. She released the cart's handle and approached the giant ruin. The bark was thick, almost a foot deep in places, providing natural insulation that no carpenter could recreate. She stepped inside the hollow. It was sheltered from the wind. An immediate silence surrounded her. The air smelled of centuries of decay and damp soil, but it was dry. "Is this a house?" Clara asked, standing at the entrance, clutching her doll. Sarah turned, her silhouette outlined by the fading light. "It is now," she said. The first hour was a frantic battle against the grime. The floor of the hollow tree was deep with rotting leaves, animal droppings, and soft punk that crumbled underfoot. Sarah had no shovel, so she used a skillet in her bare hands, scooping out debris with frantic energy. Driven by fear, she needed to reach the hard earth before she could trust the space. Clara, sensing the urgency, placed her doll in her coat pocket and began to help, her small hands gathering armfuls of dry leaves to haul outside. They worked in a desperate rhythm. The only sounds were the scraping of the skillet and their heavy breathing. It was dark inside the tree, a heavy, suffocating gloom, but as they cleared the floor, the space seemed to expand. It was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, small but large enough for 2 people to lie down without touching the walls. Once the floor was scraped down to the packed dirt, Sarah turned her attention to the walls. The lightning scar left a large, jagged opening on the south side, good for letting in light but terrible for keeping out the cold. She needed to close it before the sun completely disappeared. "I need sticks, Clara," Sarah commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. "Not rotten ones, green ones if you can find them, or hard deadfall. Bring them here." While Clara scrambled outside, Sarah took the hatchet and began chopping at the edges of the opening, squaring it off as best she could. The wood was like stone hardened by fire and age, and every swing sent a shock up her arm. She was not a carpenter. She was a farmer's wife who knew how to churn butter and stitch quilts. But fear is a powerful teacher. By the time Clara returned with a bundle of pine branches, Sarah had a plan. She would not try to build a proper door yet. She just needed a windbreak. She stacked the larger branches across the bottom of the opening, weaving them together like a crude basket, creating a barrier about 3 feet high. It would not stop a bear, and it would not stop a determined man. However, it would prevent the wind from blowing across the floor on which they intended to sleep. Darkness descended abruptly. The forest was plunged into an absolute darkness, the sort of blackness that makes one wonder if their eyes are functioning. Sarah ignited the lantern, its tiny flame coming alive and projecting elongated, swaying shadows along the tree's inner walls. The rough surfaces of the cedar resembled the interior of a grand church. Ascending into the dark heights where the trunk tapered, it was gorgeous yet frightening, but aesthetics alone couldn't provide warmth. The mercury was dropping fast, and Sarah observed her own breath in the lantern glow, emerging as white vapor. "Mom, I'm freezing," Clara murmured softly, curling up tightly on the stack of blankets Sarah had placed on the least dirty area of the floor. "I understand, sweetheart." "I understand," Sarah responded. With her thoughts spinning, she realized she couldn't start a fire within the tree. The airflow had not been checked, and the danger of setting the arid internal wood ablaze was excessive. Not at this moment. Body warmth was her only option. Unfastening the bag of flour, Sarah discovered she lacked water for dough and also no flame to cook it, even if she had the dough. They consumed a small amount of dried beans, masticating them gradually. The firmness of the beans occupied their jaws, diverting their attention from the ache of hunger in their stomachs. After that, Sarah put out the lantern to conserve fuel, and the blackness surged back, denser than previously. She reclined beside Clara, drawing the thick wool covers over the two of them. She folded the ends under their forms to retain all possible warmth. Enfolding her child in her embrace, Sarah pushed her back onto the rounded timber of the trunk. "This is similar to a bear's lair," she murmured into Clara's mane. "We're simply sleeping through the cold season." Clara remained silent. She was trembling, a mild yet persistent shaking that frightened Sarah even more than the harshness of her relatives. Sarah stayed conscious, hearing the wind wailing outdoors, a desolate, wild noise. Gazing into the dark void of the empty tree, she swore quietly, if they made it through this night, she would transform this stump into a stronghold. She would ensure the millers lament the moment they assumed 2 females would simply vanish into the snowfall. Dawn delivered a dim, hesitant illumination and such rigidity in Sarah's joints that rising required pure determination. Yet they had survived. Clara remained asleep, her respiration regular and profound, a minor wonder amid the frigid atmosphere. Sarah extricated herself from the covers, cautious not to disturb her daughter, and exited the trunk. The landscape was covered in a white frost, with every twig and grass leaf encrusted in ice formations. This was lovely, yet it served as an omen. The heavens were a dull, unbroken expanse of slate. Snowfall was imminent, genuine snow, the type that conceals fences and immobilizes animals where they stand. Sarah examined the exposed opening in the trunk. The interlaced branch covering was inadequate. In the daylight, they required a barrier. They required warmth. So, she commenced foraging. The woodland was far from barren. It was a stockpile for those who knew how to search. She discovered a deposit of gray clay along the edge of a neighboring icy stream. It was as solid as stone. However, she employed the reverse side of the small axe to break it into fragments, transporting them to the tree within the fold of her dress. She blended the clay with stream water, cracking the ice using a stone, and incorporated dried vegetation to form a dense, adhesive mixture. The labor was extremely cold. Her hands became red, then white, completely devoid of sensation down to the marrow. She compelled herself to pause every several minutes to tuck her hands into her armpits, wincing as circulation returned accompanied by sharp discomfort. She filled the cracks in the intertwined branch barrier with the clay, blocking the breeze from entering. This was gradual, harsh labor, yet as the barrier increased in height, the airflow within the trunk started to diminish. By the middle of the afternoon, the wall had sealed off 2/3 of the gap, with a sufficient opening at the top for smoke to exit and light to come in, and a narrow opening at the bottom for them to squeeze through. Sarah understood the risk. If she lit the tree on fire, they would perish. If she didn't, they would freeze. She chose a location close to the hollow's center, right beneath the tallest gap in the broken trunk overhead. In the earthen floor, she excavated a shallow depression and bordered it with smooth rocks from the stream. She transported them from the creek, persisting until her spine cried out in agony. She constructed an additional stone circle around the pit to trap the embers. "Clara!" she shouted, her tone hoarse. "Collect the green moss found on the northern face of the boulders. Large quantities." Clara nodded, delighted to be given a task, and hurried away. Inside the ring of stones, Sarah set up a tiny cone of dry sticks and wood curls. She lit a match, using her body to protect the flame. The fire ignited, gray smoke spiraling lazily upward. Sarah held her breath as she observed the smoke ascend. When it reached the arched interior, it swirled and propelled by the natural draft of the hollow tree, was drawn skyward. As the smoke vanished into the darkness overhead, the ventilation succeeded. With the sun setting, the season's first substantial snow commenced. Unlike the gentle sprinklings of earlier weeks, these were dense, moist flakes descending vertically in a white cascade. Sarah and Clara entered their tree enclosure, dragging a sizable bark slab across the lower entrance to close themselves in. The contrast was astonishing. Despite being modest, the fire emitted a shimmering golden light onto the timber walls. The rock fireplace gave off a constant warmth, while the compacted clay barrier completely blocked the breeze for the initial time in 48 hours. Sarah removed her jacket and thawed snow in the frying pan. She added flour to create a basic bread, cooking it over the fire. The aroma of baking batter saturated the tiny area, a homely fragrance that made Sarah's eyes well up. Seated crosswise on the mats, they ripped the warm bread with their hands as steam enveloped them. Meanwhile, the wind intensified outside, howling through the limbs of the lifeless woodland. The heat plummeted swiftly, transforming the damp snow into forceful icy granules. These pellets pattered against the tree's exterior, akin to countless small nails attempting to penetrate. Within, however, the atmosphere remained calm. The immense density of the cedar trunk soaked up the sound, reducing the storm to a remote, muted whisper. The fire snapped pleasantly. Its crackles and pops formed a cheerful dialogue against the fierce weather. Outside, Clara surveyed the circular space, flames reflecting in her gaze. She extended her hand and felt the coarse inner surface, which was warm. "Mom," The wicked man claimed we were homeless, she murmured. Sarah glanced at her child. Although marked with dirt, her expression radiated coziness. She observed the strong partitions, the arid ground, and the fire that sustained them. She pictured the Millers in their big, chilly farmhouse, probably trembling as the breeze pierced their wooden structure. That cruel man was mistaken, Sarah stated, her whisper firm and hushed. This dwelling existed a millennium before his birth and will remain enduring long after his departure. We are protected here, Clara. She reclined, hearing the storm's fury, sensing the tree's old power enveloping them like a cloak of wood. Having endured the eviction, their only task now was to withstand the winter. In December, the forest fell into a deep silence that pressed heavily on the ears. The rush from claiming the tree had subsided, giving way to a tiresome, colorless survival routine. For 3 weeks, Sarah and Clara had dwelled within the cedar stump. Their universe narrowed to a 10-foot span of fireglow in the quarter-mile area where Sarah placed her traps. The blossom had vanished. The beans now clattered as a scant handful in the sack's bottom. Hunger moved in as another occupant, lurking silently, rousing them at night with acute pangs. Sarah understood that foraging alone wouldn't suffice. She needed to turn hunter. At the handcart's bottom, she discovered a spool of brass wire, probably meant by her deceased husband for mending fences. She bent the wire into simple loops. She set these on the rabbit trails she spotted in the snow. Each morning followed the same routine. Rise before dawn, feed the embers, sip hot water to fool the belly, then check the snares for 4 days. On the 5th dawn, the snares were either empty or triggered with nothing caught. The wind sliced through Sarah's worn coat like a blade, yet she felt no chill. At the 3rd trap, she sensed a substantial dead weight, a large white snowshoe hare, rigid in the frozen wire. To her, it was the most gorgeous sight imaginable. Dropping to her knees in the snow, she murmured a thankful prayer mixed with sobs. This meant more than sustenance, it meant survival. Returning to the tree, Sarah didn't hide the butchering from Clara. The child observed with serious, large eyes as Sarah peeled the skin using the little knife she honed on a river rock. Nothing goes to waste, Sarah said firmly. The fur will line your footwear, the meat gives us energy, and the bones make broth. That evening, the aroma of cooking meat permeated the hollow trunk. The rich, heady smell was almost overwhelming. They dined unhurriedly, relishing the fat on their lips. Sarah preserved the hide, stretching it on a willow twig frame to cure by the hearth. She planned to stitch it into insoles for Clara's tattered boots. No longer merely sheltering in the tree, they started to truly inhabit it. Over the passing weeks, what was once a refuge turned into a dwelling. Sarah was determined they wouldn't dwell like beasts in a lair. With the hatchet, she chopped strong branches from downed pines. She inserted these into the inner wall's deep cracks to form shelves. On them, she placed their meager belongings: lamp, leftover salt, comb with careful precision, ignoring their harsh reality. From dried cattails, she braided a thick mat to lay over the earth floor, providing insulation from the frozen ground. Additionally, she constructed an elevated bed frame by binding cedar poles, raising their bedding above the ground. This let the fire's warmth flow beneath them, rudimentary yet sanitary. Smoke ascended directly through the tree's natural flue, maintaining fresh air. The dense heartwood retained warmth so effectively that they frequently let the fire reduce to embers. At night, they were cozy and nourished. And during the lengthy dark hours, Sarah recounted tales to Clara. Her stories weren't about magical beings or royalty, but about forebears who traversed seas and peaks. She constructed a stronghold of heritage around the child, guaranteeing that regardless of what the Millers seized, they could never erase their past. The disruption occurred in mid-January, during a day of harsh, brilliant sunshine. While Sarah was outside cutting fallen branches for firewood, she caught the sound of snow being compressed. Frozen in place by a horse, she clutched the hatchet tightly, her pulse thumping wildly in her chest. She gestured for Clara to retreat into the tree. A horseman appeared from among the trees, enveloped in a thick buffalo hide coat, his exhalations visible in the cold. This was Jacob, who ran the town's general store and had been acquainted with her spouse. He abruptly halted his horse, gazing at the sight ahead. He had anticipated discovering frozen corpses as gossip in the settlement claimed the widow and her offspring had certainly died during the initial frost. Contrary to his expectations, he observed a woman upright, holding a hatchet, with a tidy stack of logs next to her. Smoke swirled gently from the summit of a massive old tree stump. He examined the clay barrier that blocked the entrance and the robust door Sarah had created from bound bark. Also, rabbit pelts were suspended to dry on a cord. Jacob said, "Sarah?" in disbelief. Narrowing his eyes, he seemed to be trying to match the miserable beings who were thrown out with the strong woman now confronting him. "Everyone in town assumes you've died, and the Millers claimed you departed." Sarah brought the hatchet down but remained where she stood. She replied calmly, "We haven't left, Jacob. We simply came back to our home." Jacob dismounted, his footwear making crunching noises on the snowy ground. He approached, inspecting the tree that had become a stump. "You're residing inside a stump," he remarked, looking through the opening when Sarah cracked the door. The rush of heat striking his face was unmistakable. He noticed the flames and the rush mats. The odor of cedar and cooked flesh emanated from the shelves and bedding area, more hygienic and cozier than many lodges in the region. He turned to Sarah with a peculiar look, not sympathy but rather admiration. He confessed, his face reddening with embarrassment, "Mrs. Miller asked me to see if the site required clearing. However, you've achieved the reverse." He retrieved a tiny bag of coffee and a sugar brick from his saddlebag. "I cannot bring you into town, Sarah. I lack space, but I'll keep your success secret. It's better they remain unaware." He passed the items to her, saying, "You're truly remarkable, Sarah." Indeed she was. February came with such fury that the elderly would recount it for generations. The heavens became a sickly violet, and the pressure gauge fell so drastically that its tube almost fractured. The native peoples referred to this as the White Death. At first, the wind emitted a soft groan, which intensified into a shriek that ripped limbs off trees and propelled them like spears throughout the woodland inside the stump. Sarah and Clara sensed ground tremors as the tempest struck the mountain. This was the trial. Outside, the thermometer dropped to 40 degrees below freezing. Even airborne moisture appeared to congeal immediately. Sarah stoked the flames, adding the thick, slow-combusting oak lumps she had reserved for this occasion. She closed the bark door and secured it with a substantial timber. When it closed around them, the noise was overwhelming. It felt as if a freight train were circling them, a steady, thundering pressure. Clara started to sob, her voice fragile and scared against the storm's roar. "The tree will break, Mama! It's going to fall!" she cried. Clutching her blanket, Sarah firmly grasped Clara's shoulders and ordered, "Look at the walls, Clara, look at them." She pressed her hand to the inside of the cedar. It trembled and hummed with tension, but showed no cracks. This tree has survived 500 winters, enduring fires, lightning, and even worse storms. Its roots reach down to the very center of the earth. "Clara, this is not a house made by humans. It is a house built by God, and it will not fall." She said this with a certainty she didn't truly feel, but as the hours passed, her belief strengthened. The wind howled, looking for a crack, a weakness, a way to kill them. But the clay held, the woven door held, the tree's huge round shape deflected the wind like water off a duck's back. In contrast, square houses with flat walls absorbed the full force. The wind simply flowed around the cedar's curve. Inside, the fire crackled cheerfully, a golden heart beating at the storm's core. They were in the safest place on the mountain. 3 days later, the wind stopped, and the following silence was deep and complete. Sarah had to dig them out because snow had drifted 6 feet high against the opening. She used a skillet and a flat piece of wood to tunnel upward, until she broke through the crust and saw the blinding blue sky. The world's fences and landmarks had vanished. Roads and landmarks were all gone, buried under a smooth white ocean. She pulled Clara out of the tunnel, and they stood on top of the drift, blinking in the sunlight. The air was still dangerously cold, but the danger had passed. They had survived. Sarah looked down toward the valley floor, toward the Miller homestead. The usual smoke from their chimney was missing, and a knot of dread tightened in Sarah's stomach. She hated them. Yes, they had tried to kill her and her child by exposure, but she was not a murderer. "Put on your snowshoes," Sarah told Clara. pointing to the oval frames she had woven from willow and rawhide during the long evenings. They strapped the awkward devices onto their boots and began the trek down the hill. Progress was slow as they floated atop the deep powder. When they reached the Miller farm, the damage was subtle but clear. The main barn's roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The house still stood, but it was dark, no smoke, no movement. The path to the woodpile was buried under 8 feet of drift. They had been unable to reach their fuel. Sarah didn't knock. She pushed the front door open. It wasn't locked. The latch was frozen. The air inside the house was colder than the air inside her tree. It was a damp, tomb-like cold. In the parlor, huddled under a pile of expensive quilts on the velvet sofa, were Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Their lips were blue, and their eyes were glassy and slow as they tracked Sarah entering. Apart from some heaps of charred chair legs, the large hearth was bare. Once the firewood was gone, they began to burn furniture for warmth. In a house worth a small fortune, they were dying of cold among elegant china and glassware. When Mr. Miller attempted to talk, his jaw would not stop shaking uncontrollably. His gaze shifted from Sarah to Clara, who appeared plump, rosy-cheeked, and robust in her boots lined with rabbit fur. The truth struck him like a physical impact. Those cast out were alive and comfortable. Sarah remained silent, showed no triumph, didn't even crack a smile. She just looked toward Clara. Head to the stack of wood, scale the snowdrift, and toss logs down. I'll make the path clear. Sarah retrieved a shovel from the entryway and started digging. She labored with the robotic precision of a person who had battled all winter for each moment of survival. She shoveled a route to the woodpile, carried loads of dry logs inside, and rekindled the blaze in the massive fireplace. Moving to the kitchen, she cracked the frozen surface of the water barrel, put a kettle on to heat, and brewed some tea. She located their pantry shelves, grabbed a jar of canned peaches, and ladled them into dishes. She set the meal and beverage on the table beside the fire, and Mr. Miller broke down crying. His sobs were shattered and harsh, the weeping of a man stripped of every shred of pride. He sat bundled in his blanket, trembling, trying to warm his fingers on the cup Sarah had set in front of him. He was unable to meet her gaze. Mrs. Miller remained motionless, fixedly gazing at the flames, her dignity at last broken by the freezing conditions. Sarah positioned herself near the entrance, one hand resting on Clara's shoulder. "The firewood is piled up," Sarah stated in a monotone. "It ought to hold you over for a couple of days, but should you require additional, you'll have to excavate for it yourselves." She swung the door open, allowing the dazzling reflection of the snow to flood in. "And do not approach the tree," she added, her voice suddenly hardening with iron resolve. "The house is quite tiny, with no space for visitors." The spring season came toward the end of March, bursting with shades of green that forced their way through the thawing snow. The stream thundered with meltwater, and the woodland ground transformed into a blanket of blossoms. The community of Bannack was abuzz with the tale. Jacob, the shopkeeper, shared the details, and the physician who tended to the Miller's frostbite also recounted the widow's story. Sarah, together with the enormous cedar, turned into a local myth before the season came to an end. Folks traveled there merely to observe it from afar. The colossal cedar stump, equipped with its woven stick and mud enclosure, and the tidy pile of logs. The vegetable patch Sarah was already cultivating in the fertile ground encircling the trunk. They did not perceive a destitute trespasser. Rather, one afternoon they envisioned a frontierswoman. An attorney from the township arrived on horseback, holding a document. Sarah greeted him at the boundary of the open area, cleaning dirt from her palms. She braced for yet another forced removal, another dispute. But the lawyer grinned. "Mr. Miller has undergone a shift in attitude," the man stated while offering her the title, "or maybe a shift in his moral sense. He transferred the so-called Devil's Acre to you, claiming the property is of no use to him anyhow. The statement was a falsehood meant to preserve his dignity, a fact both of them recognized. Mr. Miller feared the public disgrace of his daughter-in-law surviving in a tree on his property while he remained warm in his mansion. Granting her the land was his sole means to regain a bit of his standing." Sarah accepted the document and gazed at the huge, marked tree that loomed above them. This tree had once held a lightning strike, provided shelter for bears, and now housed a family. The tree had cradled them inside its core, when the outside world attempted to isolate them. Sarah watched Clara playfully pursuing a butterfly by the stream, her laughter resonating clearly and robustly. Sarah carefully folded the property document and tucked it away. She decided not to construct a cabin, at least for now. That hilltop structure was built from timber and metal fasteners, and it had nearly caused the deaths of its residents. Her dwelling, however, was constructed from endurance and the passage of time.